First calling Plainview. Come in, Plainview. Anybody out there? First calling. Plainview's not out there. Hale Center, are you out there? Tahoka? First calling Tahoka. There we go. There we go. Knew they're, well, they're kind of out there. What happened to Post? There we go. We're down in Post again. I guess the region decided not to come to work on time. They can hear me when I'm talking. I should turn the mic off when I'm making sardonic remarks.
Oh, I'm tired.
I have absolutely no idea whether you guys can see your grades or not.
Right now. No.
Okay, that's the way I wanted it. I'll turn the grades on over the weekend. I want you to concentrate on the class we're doing right now. There's Post. Post, fix your camera. Your camera has been sabotaged.
Other way.
There, whoops, a little bit too far. Oh, okay. We wouldn't want anyone to be accused of being too far to the left or the right. We could all get in trouble, right? Thank you very much. That looks much better. I knew there was somebody in there. I had faith. Okay. I'll turn on the results of tests and retests over the weekend. They're all graded. We'll talk about it another time. Let's talk about what we've got left now. I mean, the American Revolution's over with. Do we have a country yet? Kinda. Not really. Maybe. We certainly have 13 independent states who have some kind of a loose linkage through their fight for independence. They have kind of a government. It's a Congress called the Continental Congress. It's not a particularly effective body. Just ask people like Daniel Morgan and others about how well the Continental Congress functioned during the war, and they'll have all sorts of evil things to say about them. Just an example, the money that went up for the war, they raised $800,000 for the entire 8 years of the war. One man raised $94 million by himself, Robert Morris. So the Congress wasn't terribly effective. It was enough. Now, when the war's over with, a lot of people went home and said, well, we did what we wanted, that's enough. And other people were thinking, don't we need to organize a government? And a lot of disagreement on that. We're going to have two kinds of terms. I'll put a PowerPoint up in a second here. I'm digging my way through to a PowerPoint. It's called the critical period. You should have that available to you if you want to follow along on your own computers. What were they operating? Somebody tell me, what were they operating under? I mean, how were they connected? They had a Continental Congress, but what was their set of rules that they were using during the war? Anybody know? And you gotta have some kind of bylaws or something if you have a club even. You have rules. They were operating under something that we'll call the Articles of Confederation. As soon as I get a slide up, I'll show you the full formal name of it. But the Articles of Confederation were kind of a constitution. The only problem was when they started writing this thing, they found out nobody agreed on anything, it was very difficult to get everyone to agree on any kind of set of rules. So what they ended up with was a really, really loose set of rules that didn't give the Congress very much power and didn't obligate anybody to do much of anything. All the way through the war, when they raised money, they raised it by begging for it from the different states. And when they raised an army, for most part, they paid them with little pieces of paper that said, when the war's over, we'll pay you some money. And those little pieces of paper, and this will come up a little bit later, maybe next class, it was like an IOU from the government. You couldn't buy much for it. So a lot of soldiers who were desperate for some money to send home to mama sold them to speculators who would give them about 10 cents or 20 cents on the dollar. So I'm a speculator, I've got some cash, I buy $100 worth of your pay certificates for 10 bucks. See where we're getting there, right? Later on, I'm going to try and cash them in with the government at face value, not what I paid for them. That's called being a war profiteer. Okay, let's see if I can get logged onto this thing. It's like chewing bubble gum and walking at the same time.
Can you not do that?
Here it comes. It says, my password's incorrect. That's interesting. Oh, I know why. There. The machine admits that I'm actually alive. I tried to fix it so you guys could see what... There it is. Plus it's a little hard. I've got a question for you guys to answer for me next time. We're jumping into the future a little bit. Listen carefully. The first president of the United States, once we have a real constitution, is of course George Washington. Was he elected according to the legal election procedures, or did they just all say, yay, George Washington will be president? How did they elect him? That's the question. Because, as we'll talk about, there's an electoral process that they set up in the Constitution. We're not there yet. We don't even know if we're going to have a Constitution at this stage of the game. We're entering a period of time that we call the critical period, and the reason we call it that is nobody's absolutely sure that we're going to survive as a country. Some people are thinking maybe we'll be 13 different countries. Some people are just hoping we'll fall apart. Especially our dear friends in Europe. This is the British, and the French, and the Spanish. All of them are kind of like vultures perched in a tree looking at us, waiting for us to die so they can swoop in and pick up the pieces. I'm dead serious. Even our friends the Dutch, all of them are what the French, they wanted to make us into a dependency. Well, if we lend them a little money, then they'll really have to depend on us and we can control them. The British thought we're just going to back off, not talk to them, and they'll come begging to do business with us. The Spanish, they just wanted money. They actually lent the money to the French, not to us. And the French couldn't pay them, so they were thinking about, well, if America, if these people collapse, we'll just move our borders north from our territory down in Florida in that area. By the way, they're going to get Florida back. I wanted you to see, up on the screen there, you see some terms. Unicameral, bicameral, what's that all about? That's about your legislature. Una being one, right? Unicameral means you've got one house in the legislature. Some states' legislatures were like that. Bicameral means you have two houses. The way we have now, the way the British have had since long before the Revolution. They had the House of Lords and the House of Commons. We have, of course, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Republic. Let's skip over that. Somebody tell me, what do we live in right now? Do we live in a democracy? Do we live in a republic? What do we live in? Anybody? Come on, answer up. Wake up, Hill Center. What do we live in?
Democracy.
Anybody else want to throw in the gas? Post. Come on, Post. I know there's somebody awake in there. Not very many, though. Most of them have their eyes glazed over. Must have had a rough evening of it last night. How about the Hoka? The Hoka, tell Coach to turn on the master mic. If he turns his mic on, then you can turn your mic on.
Oh.
Where do we live in?
Say again.
You don't know?
A democracy.
A democracy? Everybody that thinks we live in a democracy, raise your hand. You notice the old man that's standing in front of you doesn't have his hand raised? Everybody that thinks we live in a republic, raise your hand. I know you don't all do it at the same time in the morning, but what do you do when you stand up and salute the flag? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands.
See, they don't teach that anymore.
They don't teach the Pledge of Allegiance
No.
anymore?
No, but
So, Hoka, do you do the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning?
no school does it anymore.
Yes. So, Hoka does it. How about Hill Center?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
I know
Yeah,
Post,
got rid of that on
I know Post does it. Mrs. Crow would beat them up if they didn't. Okay. Yeah. We live in a republic. What does that mean? Well, our republic works on democratic principles, but we choose people that we trust to make the decisions in our government. Otherwise, if we were in a perfect democracy, we would be what they call a committee of the whole, in which every person in the country would vote on every issue. Well, in the age of computers, we might get away with that. I don't know, but just think of the likelihood of people cheating on it and hacking it, and we could have a vote one day and give away all the money that we don't have to the rest of the world, or et cetera, et cetera. The people that form our government, and we're going to talk about that as we get through this crisis period, are going to argue about exactly how we should form our country so we can control ourselves. Prorogue is a term used where the executive department of the government, the king or the president or whatever, can tell Congress, we don't need you right now, go home. King Charles I knew all about proroguing. In fact, he prorogued one time too many and ended up shortened by one head. Federalists and anti-federalists. We're going to bump into this over and over again in the next week or so. Federalists was the term we used for people who believed we needed a strong central government in order to run our country effectively. Anti-federalists were people who feared a strong central government. People like Patrick Henry, believe it or not, or Sam Adams. It wasn't a regional thing. They were afraid. All they could think was, we just got rid of a strong central government. Why do we want to invent another one? And so they were very, very much against it. And while these kinds of debates are going on in the heads of people, we've got a certain degree of apathy. The war's over. I can go home to mama. I don't want to even think about it. People in the Continental Congress didn't want to go and participate in Congress because it was too far away or whatever. And all the world is watching us, looking for cracks in the glass to see us crumble into nothing. I know that's hard to believe now, but nobody believed we would survive. And they were all sharpening their knives to get their little piece of the action. So we called it the time of crisis. And you want to see some confusion? I promised I'd show you this. Those are some of the presidents of the Continental Congress. Whoa! The reason we can say George Washington was the first president of the United States was because we didn't call ourselves the United States. We were the Confederated States. Not the Confederate States, the Confederated States. Locations of the Capitol: First Continental Congress, Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. Independence Hall, Philadelphia. Henry Fight House, Baltimore, Maryland. Independence Hall, Philadelphia. Courthouse, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Courthouse, York, Pennsylvania. Independence Hall, Philadelphia again. Princeton, New Jersey, Nassau Hall. Maryland State House in Annapolis. French Arms Tavern in Trenton, New Jersey. That's a great place to have your Congress meet, right? And then finally the City Hall, the Federal Hall in New York City, up until the time that we decided to have a capital city. It doesn't sound like it's really, really very stable, does it? It's kind of like, whose house you want to meet at this week? Here's the one man, without any doubt, that was the most respected man in the country. If you don't know who it is, shame on you. There's another man who was arguably the smartest man in the country. And we're constantly reminded about that every time we look at one of our $100 bills. There's another smart man, lawyer. He's going to become a big name in this. Let me point out about these guys. This man is a Federalist. He believes in a strong central government. This man is a Federalist. He believes that it's necessary to have a strong central government. This man is a Federalist, John Jay. He was a judge, a governor, Secretary of Foreign Affairs before he was a president, but he wasn't a president of the United States. He was a president of the Continental Congress. It's a little different. An accomplished man. There's Alexander Hamilton. If there was anybody that believed in the ideas of a Federalist, that was him right there. Full of ideas. Probably a little bit hyperactive. It was George Washington's right-hand man all the way through the war. He always wanted to be a leader of a combat unit, and Washington wouldn't let him go. Finally, at the end of the war at Yorktown, Washington gave him a unit. Let him be a general for a day. Alexander Hamilton. Lots of ideas in his mind about how to organize our country. Samuel Adams. Great orator. Probably a founder of the Sons of Liberty. Great fighter for independence. Friend of Thomas Paine. Anti-Federalist. He didn't believe we should have a strong central government. His cousin, John Adams. Hardcore Federalist. But he didn't agree with Alexander Hamilton's version of how to be a Federalist. In fact, they weren't friends. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Anti-Federalist. How'd these guys ever get together? James Madison, the father of the Constitution. He's one of the guys that pushes having a strong central government and a constitution, a real constitution, but he's an anti-federalist. He wants to limit the power of the central government. Thomas Paine, well, let's write off Thomas Paine. He was just a revolutionary, almost a professional revolutionary. When he got done writing things for our revolution, and the revolution was over, it's boring now. He left and he went and joined the French Revolution. Okay, we're in the critical period. There's the name of our so-called Constitution at the time. The Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. That's pretty hopeful. Perpetual, that means forever, right? All they recognized under these articles were just a few powers that we had been willing to grant the king when we were still loyal citizens or subjects of the king and Parliament. John Dickinson, who was, and people on the exam, some people had a lot of trouble trying to come up with the word moderate. I got all sorts of things like, he was the first normal American to write about resistance, all sorts of other adjectives. He was very cautious and moderate. At the time when some people are screaming independence, he's going, whoa, slow down a little bit, think this over carefully before you jump off that cliff. But he came around. He's the one they give the job of writing these articles so that they can work. Somehow the Congress can function. But the problem he had was that nobody would agree on anything, so you couldn't have very many rules, because every time you proposed a rule or a power or whatever, somebody would object to it. But they did get something drafted. They finally got some rules drafted to run our government during the war, except for Maryland. Maryland had a bee in their bonnet. They had a problem. I think it was an inferiority complex. It all had to do with what kind of colony they had started out being. They were a proprietary colony. A lot of the other colonies started as charter colonies. In one specific area, there's a great difference. And that is that the charter colonies were told, form your colony between this latitude and that latitude, somewhere in there. There was a natural eastern boundary being the Atlantic Ocean. There was really no western boundary at all. Proprietary colony, you were actually buying a piece of land. So it was measured out. It had limits. Now at this stage of the game, let me show you a picture. All that purple stuff in that picture was all territory that some of the original charter colonies were claiming. Up here, it's Massachusetts is claiming, Connecticut's claiming another hunk, New York's claiming another piece, Virginia claimed all the way to the Mississippi behind Virginia, and then on the other side of the Mississippi, up north. They were all claiming this territory. Maryland said, wait a minute. Just 1 minute. You don't live there. You don't even know what it looks out there. That's no fair for you to claim the whole continent when we have boundaries. And Maryland said, we will only sign on to this if you accept the fact that that land belongs to the whole country and not just to your state. And eventually, all of those states are going to give up those western territories. Massachusetts will give theirs up in 1785, Connecticut 1786. The war is already over by then. New York 1782. But eventually enough people signed on to the Articles of Confederation that became their working rules. By the way, Georgia didn't cede their western lands. They kept right on claiming them until 1802, when Thomas Jefferson was our third president. They finally gave it up, and boy, you can't believe the confusion it caused, because people were already living on the land and suddenly found out it wasn't theirs. That caused a lot of heartburn that Thomas Jefferson had to solve, but that's way in the future. The Articles, what do they allow Congress to do? If 9 of the 13 states voted for it, they could declare war. If 9 of the 13 states voted for it, they could end a war. They could sign treaties if 9 of the 13 states would vote for that. They could mediate in interstate disputes. They could coin money. They could organize a postal service. They could control Indian affairs, and they tried, but they didn't do a very good job. They could requisition. Okay, requisition can have a lot of different tones and meanings. Normally requisition, you write something, a requirement for something on a little piece of paper and submit it to some authority and you get it. In the military, requisition usually meant steal when nobody was looking. But in these colonies, requisition meant beg, get on your knees and beg for it. The Continental Congress had no rights to demand that any states give them anything. All they could do was beg for it. And if you wanted to fix that and amend the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states had to agree. If one state didn't agree, then they couldn't amend it. If you come from a family that's got 4 or more people in it, you realize how often everybody agrees on anything. We just went through that last night. I wanted to have supper at 6:30 when ended up having it at 8 o'clock. So much for me, right? I just pay for the house and all. The really important thing about the lack of power of the Continental Congress was they had no right to tax. So they had no way to collect money. If you have no money, just think of what you can't have. You can't have an army. Wait a minute, Mr. Hunt, we had the Continental Army. They were all volunteers who volunteered for militia who were converted into the Continental Army and tended sometimes to realize or think as volunteers they could go home whenever they wanted to. Sometimes they signed contracts for what that's worth. There was no executive branch. There was no administration. No, there was a president, but you know the power he had? Bang his gavel on the table. That was his power. No executive branch, no administration, no court system, no way to control commerce. Some of the states would charge tax on stuff that came from another state. No ability to tax as far as a national tax. So no ability to maintain an army. How did we ever survive? Now you know why all the vultures are perching on the trees waiting for us to fall apart. Because they all know what's going on in our country and they're all watching us, waiting for it all to fall apart. Aftermath of the war, social uncertainty, weak economy, sectionalism, meaning that different parts of the country had different goals and interests, complacency, nobody really wanted to play this game, boring, don't want to go to the Continental Congress and listen to a bunch of airbags, spout off about things that we can't do anything about anyway. They tended to distrust government. A lot of them thought that government was the enemy. Let's get something straight about that. Let's get something real straight about that as Americans, as American citizens. What's wrong with distrusting the government? There's a logical disconnect here. Why? Because you are the government. We are the government. So if you get mad at the government, you're getting mad at yourself. Because they're only there because you put them there. So don't cry about what the government does if you're sitting on your butt and just complaining. Okay, Mr. Hunt's back off of his hobby horse. We didn't have a sense of identity really as a country. We identified ourselves by, I'm a Virginian, or I'm a New Yorker, or whatever. No wonder people thought we were going to fall apart. Some people were worried about this. When we had trouble with trade, who was our number one business partner? I mean, who did we do almost 90% of our business with? England, whom we just cut ties with then. Oops. We had no traditional market in England anymore. Our Navy was, our merchant marine, the ships that carry cargo, they were about gone. If the British hadn't sunk them, we'd used them up. For naval purposes and things like that, we had a very weak merchant marine and no way to protect them because we didn't have a Navy. Another problem we had, a little bit more subtle, when the revolution started, and we were doing business with the English right up to that point. They had warehouses filled with goods to be sold to the American public. They're still there. They're still in the warehouses. And the British are realizing we're not probably going to get our money back on all these things. So what they started doing was what we call dumping. You've got a widget. I like to use widgets in all my examples. I don't know what a widget is exactly. Define it as you wish. You've got a whole warehouse full of widgets, and they're worth $2 a piece. What the heck? If we get 10 cents for one, that's 10 cents more than nothing. So they started dumping them. They'd sell their widgets for $25 a piece instead of 200. Now in our country, we had a baby widget industry trying to grow, and the cheapest we could make them was about $1.75. They're selling them for 25 cents a piece. How long are we going to survive? Big problem. How do you control that? We didn't have any laws to control it. Not only that, but we had all these rules that were, or agreements made up by the Treaty of Paris, and people are cheating on it. I mean, on our side, we'd agreed not to get in the British way of collecting debts and things like that were owed to them. They didn't get any of their money back. We didn't help them, for sure. The British didn't pull out of their outposts out in the west, along our western borders. They're still feeding the Indians, giving them weapons, gunpowder. And Spain had moved back into Florida, and they were inching their border up toward the north. They were climbing all the way up to 34 degrees, which would have chopped off Georgia. And they blocked the Mississippi River. And anybody west of the Appalachian Mountains, the only way you could do business was by shipping your stuff down the Mississippi. And suddenly, you've got these Spanish people down at the bottom end of that river blocking it off. Oh, they didn't totally block it. Cross my palm and you can go through. Tax is a little bit higher today than it was last week. Sorry, can't help it. It's inflation. At least they didn't say it was because of COVID. Anyway. So, the world's watching us. We're kind of floundering around. We don't have much in the way of leadership, even though we had plenty of people smart enough to be leaders. Most of them wanted to go home. Congress did a couple of useful things. They settled issues like how do you get to be a citizen. They settled issues about how does this country grow physically. Here's something to remember, and I'll put it in your readings. It's not there yet. I'll put it in. I'll put a summary of it. One is the citizenship issue was settled by an article in the Articles of Confederation that said a citizen of any state must be recognized as a free citizen of all the states. And it also had a little sentence or two establishing the concept of extradition. What are we talking about here? Extradition means requiring one state to give up somebody that you're charging in your state, or asking them to. For example, back then, before they had the principles of extradition, if I murdered you and then ran to another state, they couldn't touch me. Aha. That's a thought. They established procedures by which one state's courts could request another state's courts to remand a person so he could be brought to justice. It's funny, you know, you take that sort of stuff for granted, but we didn't have any rules. Land and statehood. How do we expand? Well, they passed a number of laws. I'm only asking you to remember two of them. The first one was the Land Ordinance of 1785. And basically they set up this process by which the government would survey land out in an area that they call the Northwest Territory. I'll show you on the map in a sec. They divided it into 6 mile by 6 mile townships, they call them. That's 36 square miles. and they were going to sell them for $1 an acre. Here's a quick math problem for you. If I want to buy 1 square mile at $1 an acre, how much is it going to cost me? You're missing a piece of information, aren't you? How many acres in a square mile? 640 acres. In this ordinance that they passed, they said that the minimum amount of land that you could buy in a purchase from the government was 1 square mile. And let me tell you, very, very few individuals in our country had $600 at the end of the American Revolution. So basically, who's going to buy this land? It turns out some of the war profiteers and people like that were rolling in cash bought up most of the land that was offered for sale. 2 companies in particular, the Ohio Company and the Scioto Company. Interestingly, in that law and in subsequent laws, they're going to set aside 1 square mile in every 36 square mile hunk for education. Either you can sell that square mile to raise money for education, or you can use that square mile to put an educational institute in there, or whatever. So we're already thinking about it, but it's going to be another 100 years before we have public education. A couple years later, in 1787, we passed the Northwest Ordinance. This is how you can add yourself as a state. And basically they said if in your territory you have 5,000 people, you can have a council. You can have your own assembly. And when your population gets up to 60,000, you can write your own constitution, submit that to the government, and request to become a state. And there was a question there. Do we give them all the privileges that we give the original 13 states? After all, they're newcomers. Should they really get that? We fought for independence, they didn't. But the fact of the matter is that the people in that new territory were people who fought for independence too. And they decided every new state, when it joins in, will be the same as every other state in terms of what its privileges were. There was also another little clause stuck into this Northwest Ordinance that said north of the Ohio River, which by the way was the southern boundary of this Northwest Territory, north of the Ohio River, slavery will not be introduced. I always thought Thomas Jefferson stuck that in there, but we're not really sure who put that in there. Now, that sounds good. There was a reverse side to it. It said, on the other hand, if a slave escapes from some other place and runs into that place, he can still be taken out of there. So it wasn't quite as nice as it looks at first examination. There's the Northwest Territory. Now when we talk about the Northwest, we talk about the Pacific Northwest, way out in Oregon and Washington and what have you. This is the Northwest then. It was all around the Great Lakes, what became part of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. That's the land that they're going to survey and sell. You notice there's one group of people that they haven't consulted about this? What group of people might that be? How about Native Americans? The British ceded all this territory to us in the settlement, in the Peace of Paris. That's kind of what our country looked like. Northwest Territory, then you had all the original states. Vermont wasn't a state yet. It was its own little mini republic. Some of them thought they ought to join the British territories up north. Florida belonged to Spain. There were some areas that were disputed between the British and the Americans. Some areas that were disputed between the Americans and the Spanish. There's some explanations about selling a township that we don't need to look at. We had economic chaos, there's no question, if you got a government that can't raise taxes. Robert Morris quit. He said, I don't want to be the superintendent of finance if it's all my money that you're going to use. By the way, he died a poor man, not because of this. He speculated in land and lost everything he had. Robert Morris said, asking for money from the states is like speaking with the dead. Congress tried 2 times to change the Articles of Confederation so that they could tax, and both times it failed, because at least one of the states objected. Let's talk about some of the other things that were troubling us really quickly. We had 2 conspiracies, one of high-ranking military officers and one of lower-ranking military men, both of them proposing to use military force to get Congress to pay them their back wages. In the Newburgh conspiracy, George Washington found out that some of his senior officers were circulating a petition that they were going to use a little bit of their military force to persuade the Continental Congress to come across on promises it had made to them. And George Washington walks into the room where they're talking this over. Everyone stands up because he was the most respected man in the country. And he just looked at him for a minute and he said, we fought 8 years to establish this country, and you're going to destroy it in 5 minutes? Turned around and walked out. That was the end of that conspiracy. Over in Pennsylvania, in Philly, the Continental Congress was hiding out in Philly at the time. About 400 soldiers decided they were going to march over to the Continental Congress and perhaps take their guns with them and suggest, pay us now. You owe us money. The Congress heard about this and they ran over to none other than John Dickinson, who was the governor, back then they called it president of Pennsylvania, with help. And Dickinson looked at him and said, sounds to me like you've got a problem. I'm busy today. So the Continental Congress packed their bags and ran for it. And someone finally calmed the soldiers down. But Dickinson wasn't going to help them. He didn't have much respect for him either. They had problems of debt. There was a big division on debt. Here's the issue. It would make sense to you if you really thought about it. The southern states had already paid their war debts. Why? They were agricultural. They still had their crops. So they were able to pay what they'd expended in the war. The northern states like Massachusetts and New York and some of those states, their economies were based on trade, on business, on shipping, and all of that had disappeared for 8 years. So they didn't have money to pay their debts. So they started taxing their citizens. One particular tax was called a poll tax. And despite what your civics teacher will tell you, a poll tax has nothing to do with elections. A poll is a head in Old English. It's a head tax. The head of every household had to pay this certain amount of money. Everybody's the same. Rich guy, poor guy, they all pay the same amount of money. Now you're a lieutenant or a sergeant or something in the Continental Army. You've come home. You may or may not still have the payment certificates. You may have sold them to some speculator. There's no way you can pay that tax. And so the state is bringing these people to court and taking everything they had, taking their farms away from them, everything but the clothes they had on their back. I'm talking about taking your pots and pans out of your kitchen, taking your tools for your trade, whatever, gone. And putting it on auction to raise the money to pay the debts. And a fellow by the name of Daniel Shays, spelled S-H-A-Y-S, says, you're not getting my farm. And he gets together with some of his veteran buddies, and they decide, we're going to go get guns at the Springfield Arsenal, and we're going to march over to some of the courts and show them who's who. And they got as far as going to the arsenal. Massachusetts is going, whoa, this is rebellion, this is insurrection. They send a messenger down to the Continental Congress, help! Continental Congress says, sorry, we don't have any money, so we don't have an army. We can't help you. So Massachusetts calls upon retired General Benjamin Lincoln, the guy that took Cornwallis's surrender. And he gets some other veterans, and they march out onto the road and meet face to face with Daniel Shays. And General Lincoln tells them, I feel your pain. You just can't do what you're doing. If you'll all just go home, I will go back to the Massachusetts Assembly and tell them they need to change things right now. And so they dispersed and went home. And Lincoln did what he promised to do. And Massachusetts started changing their laws, and they had an election pretty soon after that, and a bunch of the people that were sitting in the assembly disappeared quickly, and they got replaced. New York had similar problems. It's a funny thing. Let's take two of the people that are future presidents. Thomas Jefferson felt great sympathy for Daniel Shays and the guys. Kind of agreed with what they were doing. John Adams, on the other hand, thought you can't break the law. He's a lawyer. So was Thomas Jefferson, believe it or not. Two men that respected each other almost all of their lives, except when they were president. They disagreed when they were president. But there were just different views on this. And all the world's watching. Look at America. They're starting to have internal rebellions. It won't be long now, guys. The Indians were rising up, unhappy about all the things that were happening. They started attacking outlying villages, still doing business with the British trading posts out there that were supposed to be gone. People are tending to ignore a lot of the parts of the Treaty of Paris. We talked about that. Over in Europe, over in the Mediterranean, which was kind of the focal point of all world trade at that time. If you wanted to sell things, you went to the Mediterranean marketplaces. We couldn't do it. Our traders that had ships couldn't get into the Mediterranean without running into the Barbary pirates. Now, back when we were under control of Britain, the Royal Navy protected them. Now the Royal Navy's just sitting off going, ha ha ha, watch that. They didn't care if the pirates got us. They'd grab a ship, they'd hold the crew for ransom, or make them slaves, put them in the galleys, make them be rowers in galleys, sold the cargoes. Big problem for us economically. And then everybody who'd lent us money was starting to send us little love notes. It's time to pay us back, particularly the French and the Dutch. I like to give the Dutch the benefit of the doubt. It was just straight money for them. The French had an ulterior motive, and that was getting their foot back in North America. You can look at the little write-ups on these different issues. We won't waste any more time on details. And we'll start out next time talking about how some people decided to take action to fix this problem. John Jay, he was convinced we had to have a strong military to protect our commercial ventures. Alexander Hamilton was really angry that all the states were pulling in opposite directions when they should be pulling together. George Washington thought the Continental Congress was a rabble that was totally powerless and couldn't get anything done at all. I guess he kind of started showing states you can agree with one another. There was a dispute between Virginia and Maryland about where their border was. He invites people from Maryland over to Virginia, where he lived, to talk to his own people and settle the problem. People respected him. If he said, come to a meeting, they came. But his own people from Virginia didn't show up for the meeting, which made him angry. He went back up to Mount Vernon, sat down and wrote some nasty letters to some of the leaders in Virginia, and wrote more letters to Maryland and said, come to my place and meet. And they met, and they settled their differences, and they redrew the border in between Maryland and Virginia. It's still the same way that it was when they redrew it. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton are watching this saying, General, if you can do that, there's got to be some way that we can get the states to agree to strengthen the government. Madison invites 13 states to come to Annapolis, Maryland in 1786. 5 states show up. When
Your
they're done
conference is
talking,
scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
1 state shows up late. They did achieve one thing. They went home and told the people we need to solve the problem. They put the word out. And in the following year, Alexander Hamilton, without permission from the Continental Congress or anybody, issues an invitation, everybody get together in Philadelphia. Let's fix this. Didn't say how, didn't say if they were going to amend the Articles of Confederation or throw them in the trash can, but let's fix this. Continental Congress got on board in February of 1787. They said, okay, not a bad idea. And so we're going to have a big get-together starting in May and June of 1787, and we're going to end up with the Constitution, and we'll talk about that next class. Have an absolutely wonderful weekend. Don't cry too much when you see your grades. I've done all your crying for you. Got a little nauseous too. Have a wonderful weekend.
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.